It was supposed to be the best night of her life. May 16th, 2008. Spring had finally broken through the long Minnesota winter. The air was warm, but carried the kind of stillness that only arrives before a storm. In the small town of Wrenwood, population just under 2,000, it was prom night. For most, it meant tuxedos that didn't quite fit, awkward slow dances in a rented gymnasium, and parents waiting in minivans outside the school. For Mara Ellison, it was a night she'd been talking about for months. She'd picked her pale blue dress weeks earlier. She had spent the entire afternoon curling her hair in the bathroom mirror, asking her younger brother to stay out. The boy she was supposed to go with, Logan Carter, had backed out last minute. Some drama, no one remembers why, but she still went alone, insisting it didn't matter. Her friends said she looked beautiful. "I'm a little nervous, but I'm happy." The dance was held off campus that year, in a multi-purpose hall about 8 miles outside of town. Parents weren't thrilled. It meant late-night drives on back roads and less adult supervision, but the students lobbied hard. It was 2008. Facebook was still mostly used by college students. Uber didn't exist. Teens still drove themselves. Mara left the dance around 11:15 p.m., alone. Witnesses say she said goodbye to a few classmates in the parking lot, mentioned she wasn't feeling well, and headed to her car, a silver 1998 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a faded dance team sticker on the window. She turned the key, headlights flicked on, and she drove off into the night. She never made it home. At 12:09 a.m., Mara's mother, Teresa Ellison, called her daughter's phone. No answer. At 12:42, she called again. Still nothing. By 1:17 a.m., she was leaving voicemails, first concerned, then panicked. Mara's curfew had been midnight. She was always good about checking in. Always. By 2:04 a.m., Teresa called 911. The dispatcher initially flagged it as a late teen, possibly just staying over at a friend's house, but Teresa pushed harder. She knew something was wrong. Mara had anxiety. She didn't like sleeping anywhere but home. She'd never gone completely silent like this before. The first officer was dispatched at 2:33 a.m. They traced Mara's expected route home, a 2-lane stretch of Route 18 that cut through dense pine forest and ran alongside a dry creek bed. No streetlights, no traffic cameras, just shadows and trees. The rain had started to fall around midnight, first a drizzle, then heavier, masking any tracks that might have been left behind. No skid marks, no broken guardrails, no signs of a crash. Her car was simply gone. Officers checked with the school. No one had seen anything unusual. A few students remembered Mara seemed upset earlier that night, but no one could agree why. She hadn't been drinking, at least not as far as anyone could tell. Her purse, her phone, everything was with her. By dawn, the local sheriff had issued a bolo for Mara's vehicle. Helicopters searched the area. Deputies drove up and down nearby dirt roads. The Civic was registered to her mother, and the license plate, RVE 712, was shared with every patrol unit in the county. But there was nothing to find. At 7:12 a.m., Teresa Ellison was standing in her driveway in a raincoat, staring at the empty street, hoping, somehow, that Mara would come home like nothing had happened, that maybe she'd walked through the door, soaked, exhausted, apologizing for a flat tire or a dead phone battery. But the door never opened. At 8:46 a.m., the sheriff's office officially listed Mara Ellison as missing. By that afternoon, her face was on local news broadcasts. Reporters stood outside Wrenwood High, talking about the prom night mystery with two wide smiles and little information. Theories began to spread before facts could catch up. A few teenagers told reporters that Mara had mentioned going to a gas station before heading home. Others weren't sure. She might have taken the back road through Nolan's Ridge to avoid a speed trap. Someone said they thought they saw her turn off the main highway. Police considered every angle: accident, abduction, runaway. But nothing fits cleanly. Her bank card hadn't been used. Her phone had stopped pinging around 11:37 p.m., right after she left the dance. The signal dropped off near a patch of road with limited coverage, but that was common out there. It didn't help them narrow anything down. By nightfall, volunteers were forming search parties. Locals walked through the woods with flashlights and calls of her name. Police dogs were brought in, the creek was dragged. A dive team searched a nearby reservoir. Every day that passed chipped away at the hope people weren't ready to let go of. Mara's bedroom remained untouched for weeks. Her prom dress wasn't hanging in the closet, it was missing with her, but the shoes she hadn't wanted to wear were still in the corner, damp from the rain the night before. Her laptop sat open on her desk. Her calendar had prom circled in pink. And then, time passed, no calls, no ransom, no sightings, no answers. Mara Ellison had left a dance on a rainy night and disappeared somewhere along a road that should have taken her 20 minutes to drive. And as the hours turned to days and the days into weeks, one question began to harden in the minds of those who knew her best. Where did she go? And how does a girl and a car vanish into nothing? By the morning of May 17th, the town of Wrenwood no longer felt like Wrenwood. Police tape lined parts of the road no one had ever paid much attention to before. Search dogs were unloaded from SUVs while neighbors brought coffee to strangers in uniforms. Helicopters hovered over the tree line like a low, constant hum. The first 24 hours had passed, and there was still no trace of Mara Ellison or her car. The sheriff's department didn't waste time. This wasn't a runaway. Mara had no history of leaving without explanation, and she had left no note. Her bank account remained untouched. Her social media is silent. What made the search even more urgent was the lack of anything. No crash, no body, not even a broken branch. Just one girl, one car, and an 8-mile drive between a dance hall and a house she never arrived at. Search teams were deployed within a 15-mile radius. Every square foot of Route 18 was examined. Deputies walked the ditches. Locals joined in. Some used ATVs to check deeper into the woods. Others brought in their own drones. A dive team was brought in from 2 counties over and swept the riverbed at Nolan's Crossing. Dogs were run along the shoulders of the highway. Nothing. The only scent picked up was faint and ended abruptly near a gravel turnout about 3 miles from the dance venue. They ran the dogs again. Same result. Like the trail just stopped. By Saturday evening, law enforcement widened the net. They checked hospitals, motels, and nearby towns. No one matching Mara's description had checked in or been reported. They pulled phone records. The last ping came from a cell tower near Old Creek Bridge at 11:37 p.m., just minutes after she left the dance. Then nothing. No texts, no calls, no outgoing data. The phone had either died or been destroyed. It didn't add up. Officers canvassed the area again. They questioned every prom attendee, every chaperone, every parent that picked up a student. One person, a junior named Callie Green, remembered seeing Mara in the parking lot alone, fumbling with her keys. She said Mara looked upset, maybe even crying. But when she offered to walk with her, Mara waved her off. Another classmate recalled seeing headlights heading east on Route 18 right around that time, but they couldn't be sure it was Mara's car. Too dark, too far. Then came a break. On Sunday, police pulled footage from nearby gas stations. One location, about 2 miles east of the prom venue, had a camera pointed at the pump lanes. At exactly 11:21 p.m., a silver sedan pulled into view. The timestamp matched the timeline. It was Mara's car. The camera caught her walking inside the store. She bought a bottle of water, paid cash. Security footage showed her looking calm, composed, maybe tired, but not visibly distressed. She didn't speak to anyone. She exited at 11:24 and drove off, heading in the direction of her house. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Investigators froze the frame. There was no one else in the car. No one was visible behind her. No vehicles were seen following her. No figures lurking around the store. Nothing unusual. That store became ground zero for the investigation. They interviewed the night clerk, who didn't even remember seeing her until the footage was shown. He described the night as slow, raining. No one stood out. Now they had a tighter timeline. Mara left prom around 11:15, arrived at the gas station around 11:21, left by 11:24. Her phone pinged for the last time at 11:37. That gave them a 13-minute window in a roughly 6-mile stretch of road. Somewhere in that narrow gap, Mara Ellison vanished. Search efforts intensified around that corridor. Crews went through the woods on foot every 10 feet, marking off cleared zones with tape. A search helicopter flew a grid pattern. Still nothing. The media picked up the story on Monday. The words, "Prom night disappearance," scrolled across the lower third of news broadcasts across the state. Mara's yearbook photo, smiling, hair tied back, was now on every television in the county. Her mother made a public plea through tears, asking her daughter to come home, asking anyone who knew anything to step forward. Tips started to flood in. A woman in Duluth said she saw a girl matching Mara's description at a rest stop. False. A trucker claimed he saw a silver Civic pulled off on Route 7. Investigated, cleared. A psychic even contacted the family with visions of water and tree roots. Teresa Ellison begged police to follow every lead. They did, and each one collapsed. By Thursday, the press was growing impatient. Theories started forming, some grounded, some sensational. One report implied Mara had staged her disappearance, despite no evidence. Another speculated a stalker may have been involved. Police tried to control the narrative, but whispers always move faster than truth. Back on Route 18, the sheriff ordered another sweep, this time with cadaver dogs. The results were inconclusive. The rain, which had returned 2 days after her disappearance, had washed away much of the scent. With each hour, hope quietly dimmed. Her car hadn't been found. That was what stuck with people. If she'd crashed, the wreck would have been visible by now. If she'd run away, she would have needed money, shelter, and a plan. But she had nothing with her, not even her phone charger. Search teams began to scale back. Volunteers returned to work. The helicopters were grounded, and the woods, quiet again, offered no answers. Mara's father was seen walking the road alone that Friday, eyes scanning the trees like maybe she'd just walk out. Maybe she was out there, waiting. Maybe they'd all missed something. But there was no sign, not even a footprint. The girl had simply disappeared. And what disturbed investigators the most wasn't what they found, it was what they didn't. As the physical search slowed and the helicopters disappeared from the sky, the investigation turned inward. With no wreckage, no body, and no trace of Mara's car, investigators did what they always do when the trail on the ground goes cold. They turned to the people around her. Friends, classmates, ex-boyfriends, teachers. The quiet corridors of Wrenwood High School became interrogation rooms. The hope was simple. Someone saw something, or heard something, or knew something they hadn't said. Mara Ellison was popular, but not in the way that drew crowds. She was quiet, introverted. On the dance team, but not the captain. Liked books, preferred music with lyrics she could relate to. She had a tight-knit group of 3 girls she spent most of her time with. The closest of them was Sienna Mayers, her best friend since 7th grade. But on prom night, Sienna and Mara had an argument, a loud one. Several students told police the two were seen fighting near the girls' restroom around 10:30 p.m. No one caught the exact words, but it was heated. One student thought she heard Sienna say something about a secret, something Mara shouldn't have said. Sienna denied that. In her statement, she said they were arguing about a boy, Bryce Adley, Mara's ex-boyfriend. Sienna had recently started seeing him, and Mara found out that night. According to Sienna, Mara felt betrayed. But it wasn't anything serious, she said, just high school drama. Bryce was brought in next. He was calm, almost too calm. He told detectives he hadn't spoken to Mara in over a week and hadn't even seen her at prom. His alibi checked out. He'd left early with a group of friends and was at a house party the rest of the night. Text logs backed it up. Still, detectives kept him on the board. Former partners are always investigated closely in missing persons cases. But nothing in his past indicated violence. He didn't own a car like Mara's, no weapons, no history. He was just a typical 18-year-old with a tendency to deflect blame. Then came the rumors. Students began whispering about a teacher, Daniel Lorne, a long-term substitute who had taught English at Wrenwood on and off for the past 2 years. He was young, only in his late 20s, and had a reputation for being a little too friendly with students. One anonymous tip claimed Mara had been texting with him outside of school hours. Another girl said she once saw him give Mara a ride home in his truck, but she couldn't remember when. Detectives pulled his personnel file, clean, no complaints. But when they went to speak with him, Lorne was already gone. He'd left town 3 days after Mara disappeared, citing a family emergency in Idaho. It raised eyebrows, enough to request his phone records, but his number had gone dark, disconnected. For now, it was noted. Not enough for a warrant, not yet. Other leads came from inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts. Multiple students claimed Mara was off that night, on edge, withdrawn, even paranoid. One girl said Mara was crying outside near the bathrooms. Another said she saw her sitting in her car with the engine off, staring at her hands. Then there was Trevor Hanks, a senior with a reputation for exaggerating. He swore he saw Mara near the edge of the parking lot, speaking to a man in a dark hoodie. Said it looked like an argument, but he couldn't see the man's face. Claimed the guy got into the passenger seat of her car, then changed his story, saying maybe it wasn't her car after all. He wasn't sure anymore. Just that it was weird. Investigators couldn't verify anything. No other students corroborated it. And the gas station footage showed Mara alone, 15 minutes after she supposedly spoke to this man. The off-campus prom venue didn't help either. The location had no security cameras and only 2 parent chaperones, both of whom left before the final group of students. The parking lot wasn't lit. There was no event roster, no list of attendees, just scattered memories, conflicting stories, and a girl who walked into the night and never came back. Investigators built a timeline, but it was porous. Too many gaps. She leaves the dance around 11:15, appears on camera at the gas station around 11:21, buys a bottle of water, leaves by 11:24. Her phone pings for the last time at 11:37. That's it. A 22-minute window that could have contained anything, and no one could agree what. The public started to speculate. Online forums lit up with theories. Some claimed Mara had been targeted by someone she knew. Others believed she'd stumbled across something she wasn't supposed to see. One theory suggested a secret relationship with an older man. Another claimed she'd joined a cult. The Ellisons tried to ignore it, but it seeped in. It always does. Back at the sheriff's office, the board filled with names and arrows and circles. Sienna, Bryce, Lorne, Trevor, nothing solid. Every lead opened like a door and closed just as fast. Theories crumbled under cross-checks. Stories collapsed when re-interviewed. Each person had a motive that didn't quite stick. Every detail had a shadow. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a truth was waiting. But no one could find it. Not yet. Not with everyone pointing in different directions. But then the case took an unexpected turn. Because while everyone was looking at people, the focus suddenly shifted to what wasn't there. As summer turned to fall, then winter crept in, the search for Mara Ellison shifted from urgent to unresolved. The flyers yellowed on bulletin boards. The press moved on. Classmates graduated. Life continued in Wrenwood, but in quiet corners, behind school lockers, in church pews, at the town diner. Her name still surfaced like a wound that refused to close. What happened to Mara? People asked it less often, but never with less weight. And always there was the same follow-up. And where the hell is the car? That part haunted everyone. Most missing persons cases eventually yield something: a dropped phone, a broken shoe, a car door left open. But Mara hadn't just vanished. Her vehicle had too. An entire 2,500-pound Civic, gone without a trace. The model didn't have GPS. There was no OnStar, no tracking device. Investigators had her last known coordinates from a phone ping at 11:37 p.m., logged by a tower near Route 18, but that was it. The radius was wide, too wide. It gave them forest, river, and miles of gravel turnoffs that spidered into dead zones. Search teams went back out twice that summer with cadaver dogs and thermal drones. Nothing. They covered 30 square miles over 2 months. Not a tire tread, not a shred of cloth, no reflection under the water. And then winter snow blanketed everything, sealing the trail in silence. The following spring, a private group of volunteer searchers organized another sweep, focused entirely on a forgotten stretch of logging road 3 miles off the main highway. It was terrain thick with brush and mud. They used off-road vehicles and even rented a heat-seeking drone. Again, nothing, not even debris. At the sheriff's office, the case board stayed up. Mara's photo at the center, her car, silver, Civic, cracked bumper, framed beside it. The problem was no longer just how she disappeared, it was how nothing remained. Statistically, cars don't just vanish, they crash, they roll into a ditch, they're stripped and dumped, or they're found. But 15 years later, Mara's car still hadn't been located. It wasn't sold, it wasn't crushed, it wasn't on any DMV log, it simply didn't exist anymore. That kind of silence started to mess with people. Locals began to talk. Old-timers whispered about Route 18, said it was cursed, said this wasn't the first disappearance, and they were right. Over the past 25 years, 3 people had vanished along that same corridor. The cases were spread out, 1993, 2001, and now 2008. All were young, all last seen somewhere between the stretch of forest known as Nolan's Ridge and a shallow bend near mile marker 212. The first was a college student heading home for Thanksgiving, the second, a hitchhiker traveling south, and now Mara. None of them were ever found, not the people, not their vehicles. The stories were never officially linked. Each was handled by a different department, each had its own file, its own suspect list, its own assumptions. But now, with Mara's case resurfacing in internet forums and true crime podcasts, amateur sleuths began connecting dots. They mapped the pings, the sight lines, the fuel stops. They interviewed retired deputies who admitted, off the record, that they always believed there was something strange about that road. But law enforcement stuck to procedure. There were no forensics tying the cases together, no common vehicles, no evidence of foul play. In all 3 instances, it was as if the road had swallowed them whole. Even Mara's mother, Teresa, eventually came to believe that the car was key. She said in interviews that she could accept her daughter being gone if there was something, a tire iron, a shoe, a smashed window. But the car's absence was its own kind of violence. Something had hidden it, or someone had. Either way, it meant intention, it meant planning. Detectives began to suspect one possibility no one had wanted to consider. What if Mara had never stayed on Route 18 at all? What if she'd taken another road? What if she turned it off either by force or by choice? They revisited every offshoot, logging roads, utility tracks, drainage paths. They pulled aerial images from the day after the disappearance and ran them against current satellite images. The terrain had changed over time. Vegetation had grown. Hillsides had eroded. Then, someone raised another possibility. In certain places along the ridge, land movement was common after rain. The soil could shift, especially near old service roads. One theory proposed Mara's car could have gone down a slope, been buried by a landslide, or concealed by overgrowth too thick to spot from the air. But no landslide had ever been officially recorded that night, and if there had been one, there should have been debris, altered tree lines, something, anything to support it. None of it made sense. The absence of evidence began to speak louder than the evidence itself. Years passed, tips slowed to a trickle. The case was still open, still technically active, but it floated in that strange place between remembered and forgotten. Investigators moved on to other cases. Some retired, some died. But the car, the one lead that could have anchored it all, remained a ghost in the system. No license plate hits, no chopped parts found, no roadside wrecks matching its VIN, no fluids or metals picked up by magnetometers. And so the search for Mara became a story told in reverse. People stopped asking where she went. They started asking how an object the size of a car could just be gone. And if someone had made that happen, it meant the story was never random, never accidental, which meant somewhere out there. Someone knew exactly where it was. Time is brutal in cold cases. It eats the urgency, dulls the evidence, shifts the public's focus. In the years following Mara Ellison's disappearance, that's exactly what happened. The flyers faded, the reward money dried up, the leads stopped coming, and slowly, the story of the girl in the pale blue prom dress became something closer to a myth than an investigation. A quiet, lingering absence the town learned to live with. By the 5-year mark, the official investigation was barely active. The case file was still open, still technically under review, but no new evidence had surfaced in years. The detectives originally assigned had moved on, and the sheriff's department, under budget and stretched thin, had no full-time personnel left dedicated to Mara's case. Unless something new emerged, there was nothing more to do. The Ellison family didn't survive intact. Teresa and Neil, Mara's parents, separated in 2012, 4 years after the disappearance. Friends said the grief pulled them in opposite directions. Teresa stayed rooted in Renwood, still attending every candlelight vigil, still calling the sheriff's office once a month. Neil left the state entirely, moved to Des Moines, started over in theory, but never stopped checking news alerts about his daughter. Mara's younger brother, Jack, was only 10 when she vanished. By 16, he had gone deep into online forums, message boards, even the dark corners of Reddit. He collected timelines, matched satellite photos, and created digital reconstructions of Route 18 based on topography, cell tower ranges, and rain conditions the night she disappeared. He filled notebooks with theories. He printed out lists of everyone at prom that night, everyone who'd been interviewed, everyone who hadn't. When Jack turned 21, he started a YouTube channel, Where is Mara?, that gained a small following. He interviewed retired officers, explored rural roads on foot, and cataloged every abandoned building within a 10-mile radius of her last known location. But as the case passed its 10th year, the internet did what it always does. It took over the story. True crime podcasts discovered Mara's disappearance. One episode on The Vanished triggered a new wave of attention, and with it came theories. Some were respectful, most weren't. Podcasters picked apart every interview Mara's mother had ever given. Her old Facebook posts were dissected. Strangers online questioned whether she'd been too involved or not involved enough. One particularly aggressive podcast implied that Teresa's tearful pleas had felt too scripted, too controlled. Some listeners took that as a challenge. Accusations started appearing in comment sections. Anonymous users suggested that Mara had been killed at home and that the car had been staged, despite there being no car to stage. Others circled back to the substitute teacher, Daniel Lorne, who had vanished days after Mara did. They theorized he was either dead, in hiding, or perhaps had taken Mara and was still alive with her somewhere. It sounded wild, but the lack of a car gave it power. No car meant no accident. No car meant nobody. And to many, that meant someone had driven it away. Some even blamed Jack. In the absence of new evidence, the public's attention became chaotic. The original facts got buried under speculation, contradictions, and rumors. Every year on May 16th, Mara's photo appeared in the Renwood Gazette. The headline was always the same, still missing. And every year, fewer people stopped to read it. By 2022, it had been nearly 15 years. 15 years without a credible tip. 15 years without a witness stepping forward. 15 years of what-ifs, cold trails, and shrinking hope. Teresa had stopped organizing vigils by then. She rarely gave interviews. She still lived in the same house, but her phone was unlisted. Some nights she left the porch light on. She never said why. Maybe she didn't need to. And then, in late summer of 2023, everything changed. It started with a fire. A lightning strike sparked a fast-moving wildfire in a remote section of forest northeast of Twin Elms, a town about 30 miles from Renwood. It wasn't an area anyone paid much attention to. Largely inaccessible terrain, dense pine growth, overgrown service roads from a decommissioned power station. The fire scorched nearly 200 acres before being contained. A week later, a road crew was clearing a collapsed hillside near an old maintenance route when one of the workers saw something metallic under the dirt. At first, they thought it was a burned-out piece of equipment, but as the team dug further, they uncovered the rusted remains of a vehicle, a silver Honda Civic. The license plate read RVE 712. Within hours, the sheriff's office confirmed it. After 15 years, they had found Mara Ellison's car. The discovery sent shockwaves through Renwood. For the first time in over a decade, there was movement. Reporters returned. Helicopters circled again. The road where the car was found had never been searched. It wasn't even on most maps. It had collapsed in a mudslide just days after Mara vanished. By the time search crews had reached that area weeks later, it was buried, invisible from both the ground and air. The car's condition was rough. It had been crushed under tons of earth. The frame was mangled. Nature had claimed most of it. But what was inside and what wasn't would soon open a door that had been closed for far too long, because Mara wasn't in the car, and someone had left something behind. The discovery came almost by accident. August 2023. Fire crews had spent days containing a fast-moving blaze in the Twin Elms Forest, a rural stretch of pine and rock about 30 miles east of Wrenwood. Lightning had ignited dry brush in a part of the region rarely traveled. The terrain was steep, unstable, and lined with aging service roads left over from a decommissioned power grid. By the time the fire was contained, it had scorched hundreds of acres and collapsed part of a hillside near one of those forgotten roads. A week later, cleanup crews returned to stabilize the slope. As they cleared debris and ash, a worker noticed something reflective under a layer of mud and pine needles. Metal, dull with rust but clearly man-made. They dug carefully, expecting an old utility trailer. Instead, they uncovered the crumpled roof of a vehicle, a silver Honda Civic. The VIN number was unreadable from the outside, but the license plate was intact, bent but legible. RVE 7 and 12. It was Mara Ellison's car. The sheriff's department arrived within the hour. By the next morning, forensics teams from the state were on site, combing through the wreck with gloved hands and sealed bags. The car had been crushed under nearly 15 years of soil movement, root systems, and now fire damage. But the frame, though warped, held together enough to be examined, and inside, the investigators found what no one expected: nobody. There were no skeletal remains in the driver's seat, no signs of blood, no fractures in the windshield, no evidence of injury. It didn't look like a crash. It looked like a vehicle that had been parked, then buried by time. In the back seat, they found a mold-blackened bundle of fabric. It was later confirmed to be the prom dress Mara wore the night she vanished, pale blue, faded to gray, with a cracked zipper and threads unraveling along the seams. Folded beneath it was her purse, still zipped shut. Inside, a cell phone, fried from battery corrosion, lip gloss, a student ID, and a receipt from the gas station on Route 18, time-stamped 11:23 p.m., May 16, 2008. But it was something wedged under the passenger seat that stopped everyone cold: a cassette recorder, old, partially melted from heat damage, dusty, but not destroyed. Investigators bagged it carefully. It looked out of place in 2008, even more so in 2023. It was the kind of object someone would have to deliberately bring into that car, someone trying to record something or preserve something. And the question no one could yet answer was, why had it been left behind? State analysts began the restoration process. The plastic casing was heat-warped, but the tape inside was salvageable. Technicians carefully extracted it, cleaned it, and fed it through a digital converter. They didn't know what to expect. Background noise, maybe. Static. Wind. The audio began with that, a low hiss, the ambient buzz of an old analog device. Then a voice. A girl's voice. The first few words were quiet, uncertain, then clearer. It was Mara. She was scared, whispering into the recorder like she didn't want anyone to hear, like someone might be nearby. She said she didn't know where she was, that the road looked wrong, that she didn't remember turning off Route 18. Her breathing was shallow, frantic. Then a pause. She said if something happened to her, someone needed to know it wasn't an accident. If something happens to me, she said, it's because of him. Then there was static, and nothing more. The tape ran another 30 seconds before the audio cut off entirely. No name was mentioned. Just him, whoever he was. That single line shifted the case. Because now, after 15 years of silence, Mara Ellison was speaking. Not just through theories or speculation, but in her own voice, in real time, on the night she disappeared. And someone had left that tape behind, buried with the car, never meant to be found. The presence of the cassette raised immediate questions. Who was she recording it for? Why didn't she call 911? Why leave a message that vague? Investigators wondered whether the phone found in her purse had already died, or whether she had been prevented from using it. Had she been alone when she recorded it? Or was someone nearby, just out of frame? Audio specialists isolated the tape's final seconds, analyzing background noise. What they found would come later, but in that moment, the tape served as a revelation. It proved that Mara was not only alive after leaving the gas station, it proved she had sensed something was wrong, that she had been afraid, that her disappearance was not the result of a simple accident, But there was still no sign of her body, no confirmed sighting, no clear indication of what happened next. And the location of the car, on a service road not visible from the air, buried beneath a landslide days after the disappearance, made it nearly impossible to determine how it got there. The road had been closed since 2003. Mara wouldn't have known it existed. Someone else had to have taken her there. The sheriff's office issued a statement the next day confirming the vehicle's identity. They did not release the contents of the recorder publicly, but word spread fast. News crews returned to Renwood. The story went national. And with that surge of attention came new tips, new theories, and new questions, most centered on one name. A man no one had seen since the summer of 2008, Daniel Lorne. The substitute teacher who left town days after Mara vanished, the one who had never been officially cleared, the one whose phone was never reactivated, the one who, according to old rumors, had once given Mara a ride home. Now, 15 years later, the silence had been broken. And suddenly, he was no longer just a name on an old list. He was the last question Mara left behind. The forensic audio lab delivered the final cleaned version of the cassette tape less than 10 days after the car was discovered. Technicians had spent hours stabilizing the analog hiss, filtering out background interference, and isolating human speech. The goal wasn't just to hear what was said, but everything. The pauses, the breaths, the noises beneath the words. Anything that could be missed in a raw listen. Because in a case where time had taken almost everything, these few remaining seconds mattered more than ever. The voice on the tape belonged to Mara Ellison. That was never in question. Her parents confirmed it immediately. So did her brother. It was her tone, her phrasing, the soft, careful cadence she used when she was nervous. But the recording didn't sound like a diary entry. It didn't sound like something left casually. It sounded like a warning. She starts quiet, whispering into the recorder like she didn't want someone nearby to hear. There's the sound of wind, possibly rain on a windshield. No music, no radio, just her breath and fear. She says she doesn't know where she is, that she made a wrong turn or someone made her turn. The words come slowly. She pauses often, like she's debating whether to speak at all. Then she says the line that cracked the case wide open. "If something happens to me," she says, "it's because of him." She doesn't shout. She doesn't cry. She just says it with a strange, resigned certainty, like she already knows whatever's about to happen can't be stopped. There's a long silence after that, then static, shuffling, a strange bumping sound, and then she starts to say a name. "Dan!" she begins, and then the tape distorts, a warping shriek followed by 3 seconds of dead air. The rest of the recording is unrecoverable. Technicians attempted every modern recovery technique, but that last second, the part where she may have named her abductor, is gone. Melted. Lost in time or fire. But to investigators, it didn't matter. They'd heard enough. There was only one Dan ever tied to Mara's life. Only one person whose name had come up repeatedly during the original investigation. Daniel Lorne. A long-term substitute teacher at Renwood High, late 20s. Worked on and off in the English department. He wasn't officially on the chaperone list for prom night, but he had been seen there earlier that week attending a staff meeting. He was friendly, charming, a little too interested in student drama, according to some faculty. And then he vanished. 2 weeks after Mara's disappearance, Lorne stopped showing up for his scheduled classes. The school said he had taken personal leave to care for a sick relative. But that was never confirmed. He didn't return. Didn't collect his final paycheck. By the time police questioned the school, he was already gone. Back in 2008, investigators searched a small cabin he had rented just outside town, rural property tucked deep in the trees near Old County Road 5. There was no sign of Mara. No blood, no clothing, no personal effects. The place was spotless, almost too clean. But without a body and without any physical evidence linking him to the case, they couldn't hold him. There were no warrants, no arrests, and eventually, without movement, Lorne faded out of the conversation. Until now, the tape changed everything. With Mara's voice naming him and the beginning of a name that clearly started with Dan, Lorne became the primary person of interest again. Officially, he was never declared a suspect back then, just someone of interest. Now, that designation has shifted. The sheriff's office reclassified him as a fugitive in connection with an ongoing investigation. The problem? No one knew where he was. Lorne had no social media, no known family. The few friends he had in town hadn't heard from him in over a decade. His last known address, a rented apartment 2 towns over, had been vacated in June 2008. Police confirmed he'd purchased a bus ticket to Boise, Idaho shortly after Mara vanished, but he was never seen arriving. His name hadn't appeared on any employment record, credit report, or legal document since. It was as if he'd been erased. Some believed he was dead. Others thought he had changed identities and started over somewhere off-grid. But what was clear now was that Mara had known him well enough and feared him deeply enough to leave behind a message. Jack Ellison, Mara's brother, released a statement the next day through his YouTube channel. It was short, measured. He thanked the sheriff's office and the forensic team. Then he said something that stuck. "She told us who did it. We just didn't hear her until now." Investigators reopened the cabin site with new warrants. They searched the grounds using GPR, ground-penetrating radar, and cadaver dogs. Nothing surfaced, no remains, no hidden rooms, no trace of what happened after Mara's tape stopped recording. It was another dead end, but this time it carried a weight no one could ignore. Because the voice on that tape wasn't a theory. It wasn't a witness misremembering a night years ago. It wasn't a podcast spinning its own narrative. It was Mara, hours, maybe minutes, before she disappeared, telling the world exactly what it needed to hear. She hadn't run away, she hadn't gotten lost, she hadn't crashed in a storm. She'd been taken by someone she feared, someone she named. And even though the last part of that tape would never be recovered, the sound of her voice had brought the case out of silence. Now, the question wasn't what happened to Mara Ellison. It was where Daniel Lorne had gone. Once Mara's voice confirmed what many had long suspected, the focus of the investigation shifted sharply, from recovery to pursuit. With Daniel Lorne now the prime suspect in her disappearance and potentially her murder, investigators returned to the one place that had always raised quiet suspicion: the cabin in the pines. The small, weather-worn structure sat at the edge of a defunct trail network just outside the Wrenwood town limits. Technically, it belonged to Lorne's uncle, but Daniel had lived there on and off for almost 2 years before Mara vanished. The first search of the property, back in 2008, had turned up nothing significant. No evidence, no trace of Mara, no blood. The place had been tidy, almost strangely so, with no personal clutter, no signs of a hurried exit. At the time, it was just another dead end in a case that had already been full of them. But now, with new cause and new eyes, the cabin was reclassified, not as a point of interest, but as a potential crime scene. A forensic team was brought in, equipped with updated scanning equipment, 3D imaging tech, and structural mapping tools. The cabin's foundation was intact, but the wood had rotted in places, and the crawl space beneath the floor had partially collapsed from years of weather and neglect. It didn't take long before something stood out, a section of the basement wall made of different material. Not original stone, but drywall, newer than the rest. Painted to match. A hidden panel. Behind it they found a room, small, cold, about 8 feet by 10. It had no windows, no lighting except for a rusted bulb screwed into a socket above the door. Inside were items covered in plastic, carefully stacked and labeled. Not trash, not junk. Personal belongings, women's belongings. There were scarves, earrings, and shoes, worn but preserved. A comb with long strands of hair still wound between the teeth. A small box of faded photographs, some of them printed from cheap inkjet printers, others Polaroids. Most of the faces were unfamiliar, but not all of them. One photo showed a girl leaning against a locker inside Wrenwood High. Another showed her walking near a set of bleachers. Another, zoomed in from a distance, showed her standing next to her car in the school parking lot. All of them were of Mara. At the back of the room, tucked beneath a canvas bag, was a silver heart-shaped locket. Engraved on the back, M.E. Inside was a single strand of hair. DNA tests conducted days later confirmed it belonged to Mara Ellison. The cabin was sealed off as a crime scene. Investigators combed through every board, every crevice. More items were cataloged. Some had trace amounts of DNA still intact. They found a torn strip of fabric with blood too degraded for testing and a burner phone buried in a box of old VHS tapes. Its contacts wiped, its history erased. But what became immediately clear was this: Mara may not have been the only one. Of the 23 items found in the storage room, at least 11 could not be connected to any known missing persons case. The other 12 were still under review. Cold cases from nearby counties were reopened. Names resurfaced that hadn't been spoken in years. A teenager who went missing in 2004. A woman last seen at a rest stop in 1999. A hitchhiker from 1993. The similarities were subtle, but they formed a pattern. Young women, rural areas, all along loosely connected highway corridors within a 3-hour drive of Wrenwood. It wasn't confirmed, not yet, but it suggested something far worse than anyone had imagined. Lorne's name was entered into the National Fugitive Database. His photo was sent to federal agencies. A manhunt was launched, full-scale, coordinated across 4 states. Tips came in from Idaho, Utah, Oregon. None of them panned out. A few reported sightings were quickly disproven. A man matching his description was detained in Wyoming. Wrong guy. Another was seen living off-grid in the Black Hills. Also false. It had been 15 years. He could have changed his name, grown a beard, crossed borders, died. But the discovery at the cabin turned him from a former substitute teacher with a mysterious absence into something else entirely. Possibly a serial predator. Possibly a serial killer. The public response was immediate and visceral. The national media picked up the story. Documentaries pitched new episodes. True crime channels speculated wildly. But for the Ellisons, it was no longer just about speculation. It was about proximity. The man they had feared, the man Mara had warned about, had likely kept her belongings just miles from their home. Hidden in plain sight for years. The sheriff held a press conference. He didn't give details, just confirmed that new evidence had been recovered, that DNA had been matched, and that Daniel Lorne was now wanted for questioning in the disappearance and suspected death of Mara Ellison. When asked if they believed there were more victims, he paused, then said, "We're not ruling anything out." But the most unnerving part wasn't what had been found. It was what hadn't. No fingerprints, no handwriting, no trace of Lorne in the hidden room. It was like he'd prepared for it to be found and scrubbed it clean before he left. And as law enforcement reviewed every case he ever taught, every rental, every travel record he left behind, one reality became clear. This wasn't the end of the trail. It was the beginning of something darker. And Daniel Lorne was still out there. The discovery at the cabin changed the case forever. What was once a local mystery had widened into something else entirely, an investigation stretching across years, counties, and communities, all bound by a single terrifying thread. It was no longer just about Mara Ellison. It was about the possibility that she was one name in a pattern that had gone undetected for decades. In the weeks that followed, detectives began combing through cold case files from surrounding jurisdictions. They started with missing persons reports from 1995 through 2008, the period during which Daniel Lorne had been active in various teaching and tutoring roles. What they found was disturbing. At least 12 young women had vanished within a 2-hour radius of Wrenwood during that time. Each case had gone unsolved, each victim between the ages of 16 and 25. And in every instance, the final known location was rural, isolated, often near state roads, wooded trails, or small towns with minimal law enforcement coverage. At first glance, there were no clear links, no shared relationships, no common method. But as investigators dug into Lorne's employment history, they uncovered something more chilling. He had lived or worked in 5 of the towns where those women were last seen, always under the radar, sometimes as a substitute teacher, other times as a freelance tutor, a temp worker, or a night school volunteer. He moved frequently, often changed mailing addresses, sometimes never even listed a phone number. There were no criminal records, no official complaints, nothing on paper that screamed predator. But when those 12 disappearances were mapped against his documented locations, the overlap was undeniable. What started as a missing girl in Wrenwood was now being treated as part of a potential serial pattern. The FBI was brought in. Behavioral profilers reviewed everything Lorne had ever written, every known statement, every paper trail, however faint. They searched for psychological markers, trying to build a clearer picture of who he really was. The theory they arrived at was deeply unsettling. They believed Lorne was methodical, adaptive, and patient. He didn't need to act often, just effectively. He targeted vulnerable individuals in places where no one was watching. He used trust, familiarity, the credibility of a job that allowed access without raising suspicion. And when he moved on, he erased his footprints behind him. But even with that profile, the hardest truth remained. They still didn't know what had happened to Mara. The car had been found, yes. So had her belongings, even her voice, but not her remains, and not a single conclusive trace of what occurred after she recorded that final message. The tape had become a kind of echo, one that resonated across every case Lorne may have touched. Investigators began calling it the time stamp because it gave them something they'd never had before, a fixed moment in time. May 16, 2008, 11:37 p.m. It became the anchor, the center point for what might have been his final act. Every other disappearance was now measured against that timestamp, and with it, they began building a reverse timeline. Not just where Lorne had been after Mara vanished, but what he was doing in the months leading up to it. They traced a rental property in northern Wisconsin where he'd stayed in late 2007. A library card registered under a different middle name. A truck purchased in cash and later sold at a salvage auction under a forged bill of sale. But for every discovery, another lead collapsed. Most records were too old, too incomplete, and many of the small-town agencies hadn't digitized their archives. Crucial information had been lost to time, filing errors, or bureaucracy. Meanwhile, reported sightings of Lorne flooded in. Missouri, Oregon, New Mexico. A man believed to be him was seen in a gas station in Montana, but security footage proved it wasn't. A former student in Kansas swore she saw him working at a hardware store, but the name didn't match, and the employee had documentation going back 10 years. Every tip ended the same way: frustration and a dead end. For Mara's family, the renewed attention brought equal parts hope and exhaustion. Teresa Ellison refused to speak to the press anymore. Jack continued posting updates on his YouTube channel, determined to keep the story visible, but even he admitted it was beginning to feel like chasing a ghost. The hardest part wasn't the fear. It was the uncertainty, the knowing and not knowing at the same time, that her voice had been heard, that her message had reached the world. But still, no closure. And as detectives followed the faint trails Lorne left behind, they began to question how much of his life had ever been real. Even his teaching credentials had holes, aliases used to pick up contract jobs, references that couldn't be verified. The more they uncovered, the more it seemed that Daniel Lorne wasn't just a man hiding after the fact. He'd been designed to disappear long before Mara ever crossed his path. The deeper they went, the more the case stopped feeling like a single crime, and more like a system, a quiet one. A decades-long sequence of forgotten girls, overlooked details, and vanishing records. A structure built in the spaces where no one was watching. And somewhere within that system was the truth about what happened to Mara. But no one had reached it yet, because Daniel Lorne was still out there. And the question that remained wasn't just how many girls were missing, it was how many had never been searched for at all. The final 5 seconds of the tape had been reviewed dozens of times, analyzed, cleaned, looped. Everyone thought they'd heard everything there was. But after a final enhancement run through updated spectrogram software, something surfaced just beneath the static. A man's voice, whispered but deliberate. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice pattern was run through old staff voicemail logs in public school archives. The match was strong, nearly identical to Daniel Lorne. It wasn't definitive in a courtroom sense, but to detectives, it was confirmation. Mara hadn't been alone when she recorded the message. She wasn't just afraid, she was right to be. That sentence, buried under noise and time, reframed everything. It suggested Mara had been somewhere before, somewhere she'd seen or realized something, somewhere Lorne had not expected her to return to. It hinted at control, anger, and maybe a moment of panic on his part. But it still didn't say why he chose her. It didn't say where she was taken or where her body might be now. The tape ends with silence, and that's where it still stands. Her car was found, her belongings recovered, her voice was preserved, her warning was heard, but there's still no grave, no confirmed scene, no final answer, just a cassette sitting in an evidence box locked inside a secure vault at the county sheriff's office. What that tape did give was proof that Mara tried to speak, that in her last conscious moments she made a decision to leave something behind, not for herself, but for whoever would come after, for her family, for investigators, for the truth. And in that, she succeeded. The question that remains is the one she couldn't answer herself. Where is Mara Ellison? And if Daniel Lorne knows, he still hasn't told anyone. Because the truth may no longer be missing, but Mara still is.